Welcome again, everyone, to TNS Radio Ireland. You're listening to Mike Montagne, original 1968 architect of mathematically perfected economy, speaking on mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. Original material, analyses, and solution, as always, are copyright and trademarked by yours truly. All rights and therefore claims of authority are reserved. Archives of this program can be downloaded freely from perfectedeconomy.org/FTP. Copies can be distributed freely only so long as the entirety of this program, including this copyright and trademark notice, remain intact. Much thanks to the band Q-Ree of Chicago, Illinois for Patty Ryan's Despair. Find their music at qree.com. That's spelled C-U-ROI. You know, many people who are newcomers to this arena have, for some reason they have no long distance vision of what a battle there is amidst each other. Of course, if you watch the chat rooms, you see, a great number of negative people who have nothing to contribute to the real cause or understanding of the issues, solution, means of transitioning from what we have to what we need, or means of implementing what we need. So there's all this constant negativity, and in my day-to-day endeavors, I'm forced to negotiate it constantly on a 7-day-a-week basis, every waking hour. I'm helping people all over the world with understanding the issues they're confronted with, and preparing, at least, to deploy the only plausible defense against the crimes against us, which have precipitated in a global monetary failure that, my work projected from its very first moments or inception. And like it or not, then, we're forced ourselves to negotiate all the negativity everywhere around us. If we're to prevail, we can see as we endeavor to prevail, we can see that there are many improvements in our way of life which are indispensable to achieving just humanity, justice amongst ourselves, sustainable prosperity, representation. But so if we differ somehow amongst ourselves on any of these issues, this division poses a continual controversy which we must resolve amongst each other if we're ever going to prevail over these things. So you would think any of us who recognize at least that much would be inclined to argue effectively. If someone could disprove that mathematically perfected economy was a singular solution for inflation and deflation, for systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, and for inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest, that they could prove so. If there was another fault we had to answer other than the volumetric or dispositional improprieties of a monetary or purported economic system, then someone would have proven such a further fault, some dimension of money or economy which transcends or exceeds those two dimensions of money. We don't have that. And so, personally, as I'm forced to engage in all of the negativity and arguments that go on endlessly every day, my own observation continues to be that we are our own worst enemy. Even allies in this cause constantly raise the idea that, we suffer some kind of mind control or distraction. And all I have to say is that whatever is out there, I'm subject to it, as well as the people who support this initiative for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. Why is it that we understand? And so to speak, there's a constant in-your-face fact that somehow as people, as an audience, as self-determined citizens of former republics and or democracies, all of which have gone awry, all of which fail to serve us, all of which deny us representation, that we are yet our own worst enemies. It's as if you were to claim such a defense or excuse, someone has absolute control over us, that we're incapable of critical thinking, that we're incapable ourselves of resolving the issues, of confirming, corroborating a fact, a singular solution of inflation and deflation. For example, who amongst us can invalidate the simple idea that if inflation and deflation are defined respectively as increases or decreases in circulation per whatever, represented wealth, represented property, that there's one and one only solution for inflation and deflation, that being to maintain a circulation which is always equal to the remaining value of represented property. Neither is it to our credit that we fail to realize then that there's one and one only just way of accomplishing that object, which is to pay and to retire principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. And of course, the person that should do this is the obligor of a promissory obligation. And a promissory obligation is the only reasonable currency of any just economy, because it must come into existence and go out of existence in concert with expiration or consumption of the related property. These aren't difficult things to understand. And I always think as I go through the day and wage this constant war where, as soon as you demonstrate something which is so simple, unequivocal, and absolute, immediately people turn around and decide that money has to be something else. It has to represent energy or resources or time or love. I'm constantly confronted with all these ideas as if They're worthy obstructions to the facts of singular solution, which we regularly negotiate, and which people here, for some reason, claim they can't understand. Do we not have to solve inflation and deflation? Well, whenever we contract, we promise to do something which may involve paying money for production or giving up production for money at some different time. And if we allowed the value of money or the value of production to deviate from what we had determined rightly at a given time, this would subvert our purposes and potential rewards of contracting. We can't suffer a currency which can mutate in terms of value or representation. We have to preserve this at all times. And as we've discussed, there is only one way to do so, and that's to solve inflation, deflation, and maldisposition in a circulation which is fully dedicated to the purposes of maintaining a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that much for represented property. As we've already said and shown, the only way to do so is an obligatory schedule of payment, retiring the principal of a promissory obligation according to the rate of consumption of the related property. So we've been through this over and over and over again. We've demonstrated how to immediately convert any of the purported banking systems which have been imposed upon us into mathematically perfected economy. We've shown how to do that immediately and virtually without cost. We've shown how to implement mathematically perfected economy. We have constantly people who stand up and make negative comments which are totally irrelevant and which only, of course, impede our achievement of these objectives. And there's reasons that people always do these things. Sometimes they have a conflicting objective. They might, for instance, defend the banking system because they themselves are exploiters who intend to persist in exploitation because they've adopted that as their way of life. And so they view solution as inimical or adverse to their only means of sustenance. So what do? They call bad names, they attempt to denigrate you, whatever. Another person just may be, frankly, ignorant. They can't prove that there's an alternate solution to inflation, deflation, and I'm sorry, but that's the most elementary math. We expect our 7-year-olds to be able to master the arithmetic of the only solution to inflation and deflation. And, I've brought the issue up amongst younger children, kindergartners even, who've understood, the problem immediately from a simple explanation of it. And frankly, we say that we think that they have some advantage because their minds haven't been polluted by absorbing garbage. But we as elders willingly absorb the garbage, and so would these children if we continue to allow our education systems, supposed education systems, to pollute their minds. Now, if we don't take our children, aside and say, what are they teaching you about economy? What is the truth of the matter here? Why would you believe it when they tell you that? then we're failing ourselves to teach our children. But when we stand up in a forum and shout names and denigrations against mathematically perfected economy, what are we but even worse, if not our own worst enemies? So to utter dogma, money is created out of thin air, ourselves, etc. We're only denying ourselves again and again and again the only means to identify our problems, their solution, means of transitioning from what we have to what we need, and means of implementing what we need. These kinds of discussions are inconducive. But, as a study of history and what we're doing now, what we're going through now, people who stand up against these things now, what is transpiring before us that we are a part of at this present moment is history. History, as they say, is made every moment. And it's not as if those of us who are trying to overcome this negativity aren't aware of the reasons that people do what they do. And we're always biting our tongues, although we're forced to address issues every time somebody comes up, says to me, takes what I've just explained and immediately turns into, it's a Ponzi scheme, or it's a pyramid scheme, or they're creating money out of thin air, or the interest doesn't exist. All these preposterous assertions, which are not only meaningless, but wrong, serve us not. Why would you listen to simply transform understanding into these preposterous obfuscations of understanding which have no power or substance to serve us? So there's a question whether, why we should go on and on and on explaining the same things over again. And in truth, because we've done this so many times, I feel it's important to, if somebody's in a forum, and they post money is the root of all evil, it's important to counter that. Why? Because it means nothing. First of all, it takes a saying, which is completely different. The love of money is the root of all evil. Transforms it into something which isn't true. Money is not the root of all evil. This money that we suffer is a root of much evil. It defrauds us out of all of our production. It imposes terminal failure upon us. But we can't understand that by taking a saying, the love of money is the root of all evil, obfuscating or let's say polluting it, adulterating it, bastardizing it into a different saying, money is the root of all evil, when in fact that's not true, because if we rectify money, it's our protection. What money is, when we eradicate banking, when we eradicate exploitation, and when we solve these three simple categoric faults, which is already inflation and deflation, or inherent multiplication of falsified indebtedness, is solved by eradicating this particular form of exploitation that we're suffering. We still have to solve inflation and deflation to solve the rest of the problems, and we know that this is a simple obligatory schedule of payment that retires principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. So knowing that, why would anyone say that money is the root of all evil? Because when we solve that, what is money? Money becomes basically a receipt for the fact that we have given up production to someone else for entitlement to a like volume of production. Money, when it's rectified under mathematically perfected economy only, becomes simply a receipt for what we're due on account of what we've given others. Now, if we wanted to give that away, there's no problem under mathematically perfected economy. You can give your money away, you can give your production away. It matters not. Whatever you want to do with it is self-determined. It's your right. It remains your right under mathematically perfected economy. In fact, that's one of the fundamental principles of mathematically perfected economy. So it's utterly ridiculous that people, argue against it, that a love-based economy is, or sharing-based economy, which dispenses with money, is our true objective, because in truth, mathematically perfected economy is that. The thing is that if you built a house for your friend, for instance, and somebody else could just come along in a sharing-based or love-based economy and say, well, thank you for loving me and thank you for sharing with me, and take over the house, you would be denied your intention, which was to give that house to your friend for whatever the reasons. But those reasons are yours, and they're your right. Now, if we just simply produce or conceive that we can simply produce and give this to away, well, that might be a worthy way of acting, but you can't even give it to who you want to give it to unless your right to do so is preserved. And a rectified money, that's all its purpose is to ensure that you have that right. You build the house, you give it away. That's fine. You earn money, you give it away. That's fine. But you're giving it to who you want to give it to. If you want to give it equally to everyone, that's your business. But to assume that we should give it to everyone or whatever isn't necessarily the same conclusion that others would come to. In other words, if I build something that has a market, that can afford it, and has another market, which is the market that really fulfills my work, that's the market I want to deliver my production to. Now, if I don't have a right to be selective in that, then I'm denied the very purposes of my production. And so, for instance, I'm a world-renowned cane fly rod maker, retired, unfortunately. But the reason that I did what I did was to take performance to a level it had never gotten to before, to refine design far beyond what had transpired before by the best efforts of others. And this is something that you do for love, indeed. I mean, the monetary rewards don't justify it. You could do the same work in a machine shop and or a wood shop, and be paid more for building something relatively mundane, like kitchen cabinets or houses or whatever. But to me, the reward was to accomplish things that hadn't been done before, to build machines that worked to finer tolerances and produced finer finishes and fits and joinery, to work faster and quieter and produce less waste. All of these things figured into everything that I did at any given time. So, of course, I fully understand then that the love of whatever you do is for some of us who decide for it to be so, it's generally the chief guiding object of what we do. But money preserves our right to the production of others for production we have given up. Now, we can work without money as well, and that's completely compatible with mathematically perfected economy. When we choose to protect our right for production, though, of others, for giving up equal production of our own, we have to do that through some media. And mathematically perfected economy, in its simplest terms, is the perfection of that media. It eliminates all extrinsic exploitation of our commerce between each other, and sustains what we've agreed in terms of volumes of exchange. We've taken a volume of money which has a given value at any particular time, and given that up for property that we produced or possessed, and we're claiming an entitlement to a like volume of property. And if we allow the value of money to change over time, and particularly to diminish, as it will under the present system, at even an inherently escalating rate, then we'll deprive ourselves, unless we spent the money immediately, of just reward for the intended transaction. And that's all it is. So why all the negativity about that? I mean, who in their right mind has any objection to such a thing? The only people who would ever rightly object to that would, according to their own compromisation of principles, in which they believe that they have a right to exploit the rest of us, would be preserving the means to exploit us by denying us solution. So those are the only people who have a reason, which isn't against themselves, to obstruct or deny us solution. The rest of us bickering amongst each other, what for? Why do we compromise an understanding of these things immediately? Well, it's strange, because this is, it's sort of a degenerate human behavior that I observe. When we were all in school, we misbehaved. We may or may not have been taught very well what the principles of behavior for, what the objects of behavior were for. But, we figured it out, or we didn't figure it out, and we adopted better behavior, conducive behavior. And I observed something that, after we leave school, it's odd. You have many married couples, for instance, who can't even get along together, fight constantly, are unable to agree, and yet stay tied together as a couple, for instance. You have people who lose the train of thought, the faithfulness to principles in life, which achieve anything. Anybody who takes, the evolution of a given device or mechanism or industrial process, anyone who takes any such thing further, masters its principles and develops a better implementation of them, or realizes a further principle which hasn't been recognized, or refines our understanding of principles from what we assumed was the inclusive facts to something which is maybe perhaps in terms of terminology or expressing it is slightly different, but has a whole different set of implications. For instance, when I built fly rods, I just spent one evening analyzing the ballistics of a casting cycle, because there weren't any good, there wasn't any material on a casting cycle, the ballistics and manifestation of a casting cycle in fly casting. So I just sat down while I started to cook dinner. I've been practicing casting from my porch, and I regularly did this, and because my fishing techniques depended generally on distance casting. So I sat down and I worked out the, what amounts to 2 phases of a casting cycle: an increasing bending phase to a moment of greatest bending, and then a recoil phase after that. And I started out with principles that, being as a fly line has generally low sectional density, it's not very efficient for sustaining its inertia once it's accelerated, particularly if it deviates from a line. So recognizing that the most efficient aerodynamic configuration of a fly line, even if it's a fast sinking line, which is the most dense fly lines made, the most efficient aerodynamic configuration nonetheless is a line. So the ballistic ideal was to align the backcast into a line of departure, and then during an increasing bending phase of the casting cycle, it would be necessary for the tip of the fly rod to take the line of departure by increasing bending during the bending phase until a moment of greatest bending was reached, which I could see obviously was perpendicular to the line of departure when it passed through the axis of rotation, was the closest the tip ever got to the axis of rotation, which is basically your hand or your wrist, which is moving to form an axis of rotation, which isn't exactly in your wrist or your hand. So after that, the fly rod would have to recoil. Ideally, the tip would stay close to this line of departure, because in leaving it, it would form the cast in a configuration where it was less aerodynamically efficient. And to just deviate one line diameter from a perfect line multiplied the air resistance by 2 almost. It's not exactly true, because the way that the line is configured affects this. It more or less forces it to plane out of the original line of departure, but it does increase air resistance, and the planing is caused by this increased air resistance. So nonetheless, the ideal was a perfect line of departure. So it was incumbent upon fly casting to understand these principles, and yet they didn't exist in any book. And I sketched all this out in 5 or 10 minutes on a piece of paper on my table while I began to cook dinner. And then, as I thought about this, I jumped back to my piece of paper and I looked at it again. And I said, what that means is that everyone was talking about a fly rod bending and then recoiling and delivering energy. And I said, well, shoot, that means that in truth, practically all the acceleration is created during the increasing bending phase of the casting cycle, not during the recoil phase, because in order for the rod to recoil, the force has to decrease. And as the tip leaves the line of departure, in fact, the fly line begins to pass the tip because its effective forward speed is less than the fly line. So I immediately realized that practically all of the acceleration, very little thereafter, is developed during the increasing bending phase of a casting cycle to the moment of greatest bending. Well, this had incredible implications toward rod design, and I suddenly it was for 15 minutes in this one evening that I became I built cane fly rods, and that was really only to build prototypes in a design concept to prove the concept for higher modulus construction. And so being as I built motorcycle racing frames and understood the physical, mechanical principles of optimal structural designs, I immediately saw likewise that the basic designs of fly fishing rods were actually terribly errant and deficient. Why? Because in order to accomplish this object of linear acceleration, we had to bend increasingly during this increasing bending phase of the casting cycle to a moment of greatest bending. Therefore, given that there was some optimal bend form for a fly rod, there would be a maximal section depth that we could build for the rod to bend in such a way. That is, given that bending and section depth, the section depth could increase to no more than where we would suffer either maximum tensile stress or maximum compressive stress on the bending member. Well, that meant that the performance of a fly rod was extremely limited because we could only build to a maximum section depth for the necessary bending. The only way to increase the power of the rod beyond that, since we have to suffer that much bending, is to increase its width. And of course, the most efficient place to do that is in what I called the work performing flats. So I began to build fly rods, unlike had ever been built before, like a bow limb, wider than deep in the plane of bending, and by adopting this section configuration was able to build rods many times stiffer than had ever been built before, and by extremely radical hollow building I was actually able to build cane rods both lighter and stiffer than modern graphite rods. So I took cane fly rod performance, owing to 15 minutes of analysis one evening, to, in general, what I built was generally about 450% as stiff and efficient as anything that had been done before, which meant not that I could cast 4.5 times as far, because that higher velocity is bled off all the faster. But the improvements in performance were incredible over any rods that had been built before. I mean, it was a cane rod that cast very far might cast a floating line 70 feet, deliver a fly 70 feet away. And my first international sportsman exposition, I'm kneeling behind the casting platform as if I'm in the water, weighted up to, the top of waders or to your waist or so, and casting clear out of 168-foot casting pools in Moscone Center with a 7.5-foot foreline. So the increase in performance is just phenomenal. Not only that, the loop control and everything that was accomplished by improvements in tapers. I became a software engineer, and the first program that I wrote resolved the ideal bend form of a fly rod. All the prior thinking came up with the idea of 3 different schools of thought. One thought that the most efficient rod was what they call parabolic, which is something of a misnomer because most of the bending was down. There was a lot of bending down low in the rod, and there might be a supple tip, and there generally was in conjunction with it. But owing to building an under-stiff butt section that would be overstressed terribly by pushing on it really hard, a rod could be built of a given weight that would cast farther than other designs of that weight. But it was terribly misbehaved because it didn't respond immediately. It was In fact, a rod does the opposite of what you want it to do when you overstress it. If you hold the tip off the floor, and with a grip while you're standing and jerk a rod upward, the tip hits the floor first. So this is a phenomenon that I call counter deflection. Well, so it's important to build a rod that has a butt section stiff enough to propel the upper parts and to control them. And the wide arc of recoil of the so-called parabolic design, is terribly inconducive to fly casting. It generates a great number of waves in the lower loop, and we don't all have to understand these things. What I'm talking about is achieving objects which have existed for 100 years of fly fishing all in one evening simply by observing what's going on and what the governing principles are, and then being faithful to those principles in a design concept. So I built these, rods, and I needed to know how they had to bend, because there was these three different schools of thought: the parabolic, then the next school thought that a rod had to bend equally throughout its length, and then another school thought it needed to bend progressively, but how much they didn't know. The latter turns out to be correct, but it also turns out that there's great refinement of that which had only been done empirically at the time, that is by experimentation, and being as there's a lot of hours in building a prototype to bend in a certain way, of course, we can only progress a certain amount over a given time by even very carefully strategizing how we intend to experiment with these things. So what happens is over 100 years, very little progress is made in the fastest tapers, which turn out to be correct. But how do we resolve that was correct? I mean, no one knew it was correct. We had three schools of thought which bickered with each other, and they had advocates of each. Well, I designed rods, and I did hundreds of hours of calculations to evaluate the potential performance of a prototype. And this friend used to come by my shop, and he used to say, you really ought to think about getting a computer. And I'd say, a damn computer can't do anything that I can't do. And he would laugh. He would say, yeah, but it sure can do it over again a lot faster. And finally, he talked me into coming over and seeing a computer, and he had me give him several formulas that he typed in, cells, and these operated on base values and gave answers, and then the next formula would, operate on the last answer of the last cell, and he showed me how all this stuff was linked together in literally 1.5 to 2 minutes. I just spewed out some formulas, and he says, so if this changes, he types a new value in the basal cell, there's your answer right there. It was all immediate. And I went, whoa. My next question was, so how much is one of these? And my friend sold me his computer for $250, but he wouldn't let me take it home until I learned to touch type. So he made me use this typing program that taught you how to type on a computer. And I mean, the first evening I was up to about 30 words a minute, and I came back the next evening, and I stuck with it. He insisted I do it 15 minutes a night for 2 weeks, and I actually enjoyed mastering typing so quickly that I spent more time on it. But I came over again the next night, and I wasn't going to buy the computer because it wasn't manly to learn how to type, right? And so anyway, the next night I got up to about 45 words a minute, and he says, you can take it home now. So I transferred all my formulas into what was an early spreadsheet program, and and I could do hundreds of hours of calculations in seconds now. And yet I got to this part of building my first spreadsheet, 2 nights later, and I called my friend up and I said, I got a problem here. If the answer falls in this range, I want this formula to be executed against the answer. But if it falls in this range, I want this formula to be executed in, and then if it falls in this other range, I want another formula to be executed against it. How do I do that? And he says, well, he started to laugh. He says, well, you've outgrown spreadsheets already, so you're going to have to learn to write software now. And I said, what? He says, yeah, you're going to have to write all the code to come up with all this. So don't worry, it's not that much different, but you're going to have to, write all the math and make it post the answers in the places you want to see them on the screen or a piece of paper or whatever. So you're just going to have to take your math and convert it into a different form, but you're going to have to put conditional statements in there. So he brought over a set of programming manuals and programming tools, and we installed it on the computer, and I'd load it every night and save my program. And it took me many months to write this, but I wrote an application, which was a formula. It took two parameters, and it it basically spit out virtually any kind of a curve form, which could conceivably represent a fly rod at a moment of greatest bending. Then it deflexed it over the casting cycle, and then through Newton's principle of the acceleration of gravity. That is, the mass of an object acting on the object accelerates at approximately 32 feet per second. By relative force across the segments of a casting cycle, I could determine the relative performance of every bend form, and that is program the application to determine the relative performance of every bend form. Plus, by decreasing the force of the casting cycle and then redrawing it more or less accordingly, I could also analyze the versatility of any bend form, and likewise, the program could analyze the recovery characteristics of any bend form during the recoil phase of the casting cycle, which certain attributes of the behavior negatively affect the cast, and so there's an optimal set of behavior that you're looking for, which is fastest recovery and narrowest band of recoil arc that the tip takes, which keeps it closest to the line of departure. That's what you're looking for. That's your ideals. So I wrote this program to cycle through a range of parameters which governed the range of bend forms that it would generate, and then perform all this analysis, and it would graph them, it would draw them out for you, it would show you how every one of these casting cycles works. So I spent 6 months conceiving and developing this application. But when it was done, it resolved 100 years of bickering to an ideal bend form for a fly rod and during a casting cycle. And so I built these things, and it was extremely successful design implementations based again upon observing what's going on, ascertaining what governs it, and faithfully engineering according to, therefore, what are the involved principles. It's an even far less difficult thing to optimize economy, to eradicate exploitation, and to preserve an immutable currency. Now, all the reasons why we do what we do could be complex and circuitous, because we go out into life and we answer to all of people's misconceptions about things. But what's remarkable to me is, that people marvel that you might, do things such as this. And the only reason that we do, instead of all of us being involved in refining whatever we attack ourselves, and then sharing what we do, and conversing over the principles that we ascertained and we implemented, and how we got from A to wherever we got on the way to C. The only reason we marvel about this is because some of us have just never got that in the first place from school, and they haven't continued it throughout the rest of their life. There's no reason for us to bicker about all these things. I mean, somebody will come up to me, many years later and say, well, I proved that a fly rod has to bend a different way. I mean, first thought out of my head is, no, you didn't. I mean, how in the hell could you possibly have done that, And they start and they explain that part of the principles that, I ascertain, and then they deviate from them somehow, just to say that something else might work better. But which conclusion they come to is readily disproven because there is an optimal bend form, and to deviate from it shows, for instance, if it's too stiff in one place, it's got to be less stiff in another place, which more so compromises where the tip can get to in a certain amount of time. Likewise, if it's, stiffer up in the tip, that means it has to bend more down below, which means you have less fast response, you have a wider, arc of recovery, you have a whole different characteristic buildup of accelerated forces during the increasing bending phase, which compromises its performance. And if you've been through these things, truly been through these things, analyzing all these things, and I mean, first time I ran this program, I figured by the time I was done with it that it would have taken me like a minimum of 600 years to manually calculate what that program was going to do, and however long it took to cycle through this entire range of bend forms, which went way beyond the extents of what was truly plausible, just in case there was something out there to be discovered and learned from it, And it did all this in like 20 minutes. It produced all the answers and nails it. Given that you want a certain speed of a rod, that is, or let's say magnitude of performance is a better way to express it, because these are all phenomenally what we call fast rods, because all the bending is up in the very top of the rod. There's very little in the rest of it. And the shoulder, the location of it is critical to be a tiny fraction of rod length, high or low in it. It tremendously impedes or reduces in performance. There is an exact, very exacting geometry which is critical to ideal fly rod performance. So it's not as if somebody can just, do a little bit of work, borrow from some of your thinking and 40 years down the road and say, well, there's another way to get there from here, and this is just as good. You can run that bend form through my program, and it already generated that design in the first place, and it proved it was inferior. And it didn't prove it was inferior by some lackadaisical divorce from principle. So, what really baffles me, that's why I'm not paying any attention to the chat rooms. It's not because I don't want to communicate with people. In certain places, you have people who are adverse to solution. Now, we can spend our lives there. We can just bicker with them forever and be forestalled in achieving whatever we intend to achieve. People who want solution will seek it. They don't raise every possible, obstruction to our progress that they can think of. Instead, people engage in understanding, and this is the only positive thing that develops the progress that isn't just an eventual objective of humanity. It's indispensable to our immediate progress. Now, one thing that I think is really, it's quite interesting is how we get wherever else we get, and how after we leave school, it's as good, when the teacher stands up before the class and says, today we're going to learn the Pythagorean theorem, which is that sum of the squares of the right sides of a right triangle equals the square of the hypotenuse. It's like one of us can prove that theorem off the top of our head. A few other people will try the wrong way. And let's just say we weren't in a classroom situation. They might even believe that they had proved it, although they hadn't, only because whatever they said wasn't conclusive or comprehensive. It didn't account for all the issues that we have to account for. Other people might think they understood it, whereas they didn't understand it by the principles which make it what it is. And so the difference in their understanding and the understanding of the person who could prove off the top of their head that the sum of the squares of the sides equal the square of the hypotenuse is those who purport to understand it only memorized it. Now, if that fact that had been given was instead a non-fact, such as is asserted by economy, that we have to borrow money from banks, for example, what are we purportedly understanding? We don't understand that we have to borrow money from banks unless we trace the creation of money back to its necessary and faithful principles, which accomplish some set of objects that we all have to accomplish to sustain whatever we want. That is, to maintain the rectitude of our contracts and our contractual obligations, to achieve the rewards of contracting and of obligations, to maintain an immutable currency just so that our savings doesn't lose value so long as we hold on to it to spend it at some future time at which we would want it to have equal value as before, and no more than that if we're just people, because if it had more value, we can't just jump up and down and say, hooray, our value of our money is going up, if the opposite of what's happened were happening. Why? Because our own children producing a generation later that we're buying their production from, would have to do more work to have the reward that we had. And so true economy and monetary justice are critical. These aren't things that we can just say, well, it's not important, it's too complicated. It's not too complicated because we're simply solving inflation and deflation, or our volumetric improprieties, by an obligatory schedule of payment. Or on the other hand, we're eradicating exploitation by eliminating banking and its imposition of interest on a falsified debt, which it's laundering into its own possession and is pretending is at risk even after we've paid the principal. Which is another thing which is just utterly ridiculous. I mean, if the principal is at risk, justifying interest, why do they make most of the first payment against interest? And even after we've paid so much in interest as principal, they're still presumed that a risk exists, after which they charge interest. There's no justification for that whatsoever. So banking is a very rigged game, but we can't just say it's a rigged game. We have to understand that what the rigging is, and that rigging is simply this obfuscation of the currency that I've been explaining all this time. The rigging is Vince and I were discussing the other day. It's a breach of trust, as Vince puts it. What's the breach of trust? The breach of trust is that this money that is created, because before any money exists, money has to be created to begin such a system. And only when we trace it from its beginning to any other further ramification or consequence are we really truly accounting for whether or not the involved processes are justified. And of course, they're not. When banking simply imposes itself upon our ability and right and authority to issue promissory obligations to each other, to issue representations of them on their paper or their coin or whatever, and to subject them to interest, those representations to interest, as if we're borrowing them when they're merely created as a further representation of our promissory obligations, and the only reason for that is to exploit us. Well, obviously, we have to do something about that, particularly when that obfuscation launders principal into the unrightful possession of the banking system, and the fact that it subjects the principal to interest imposes this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation, not which is deficient to pay interest, because it's not as much as the principal and interest together, but which instead forces us to maintain the circulation so long as the banking system isn't assuming so much of our production. So we're forced to borrow principal and interest back into circulation as a new debt equal to the former sum of debt, which otherwise would have been resolved but cannot be resolved because we're forced to borrow the principal back into circulation, thus maintaining any prior sum of debt and making it mathematically impossible to be paying down any prior sum of debt, whereas the interest that we're paying out of our possession and borrowing back into circulation therefore is increasing the sum of debt perpetually by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt until we suffer the present failure. So these things are not difficult to understand. I mean, there it is again in yet a nutshell. But what do? We go out and accost this person who's making things too complicated, who's using the wrong words supposedly. I mean, this doesn't happen everywhere I go. In many forums where people are conducive to solution and not arrogant themselves, we don't have any bickering. People understand this, and people come to me all the time who just get their feet wet in mathematically perfected economy and immediately recognize that it's the only solution. And that compels them to study it and master it before I ever even hear from them. And I regularly hear from, more people than, bicker in these forums here and accost me, that they understand it immediately. So, unless those who bicker can disprove any of these propositions, and no one has in 44 years. I mean, it's preposterous that anyone would even think that there's an alternate solution for inflation and deflation. And the reason that there's only one solution for irreversible multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest is that the interest isn't justified, And so my work is what exposes this fact that it's not justified. Even if we were to say, well, its consequences are terminal, which my work likewise unraveled, that's not enough. People came at me forever saying, well, who would loan us money if it wasn't subject to interest, and particularly if interest is terminal, because, especially in the later parts of the lifespan, the lender needs interest in order to insulate themselves from the risk of default. Well, see, what I had to explain to these people all this time was that they weren't borrowing money from a bank, that the banking system was simply publishing further representations of our promissory obligations. That's how all money is created. And then They launder the principal into their unwarranted possession, which is crime number one. And then crime number two is as if that principal was their rightful possession or evidence of their due from the overall pool of wealth. They impose interest upon it, which is what's terminal. So, being as neither interest nor this laundering of principal into the possession of the banking system is justifiable, they're crimes against us. They're imposed as obfuscations of facts. This breach of trust is a deception that we're borrowing money from banking systems. Now, if later the bank says, well, okay, so we're loaning you the money of other people, well, you actually don't have a right to do that either. There are further arguments about that, and you want to talk about complicated. Well, we have to address those as well. Well, that's a card that I'm still holding to my chest, because plagiarists can't answer it. They don't even raise it as an issue. And that's a remarkable thing. If you stop time right now and you look everywhere around you, you won't even find a plagiarist who's raised that as an issue, much less who's explained it and can answer it. So how do we get like this? Why are people shooting this idea down? Is there anything that can serve you more? Is there some reason to presume that we're well enough off by settling for something less? Absolutely not. I don't know. I've always been rather incredulous about this aspect of human behavior. And I mean, if anyone denies that I'm rightly so, go ahead. Explain how it's not right to be incredulous about this kind of behavior. When I was a kid, the much older kids, that often, I'd tag along with much older kids. And, there's so many experiences you have in life which, show how preposterous it is to take reality and to delude ourselves that it's something else, or to wage an illusion against others for some other object. When I was a little boy, I designed airplanes, before I was even in school, from watching my father work, and I built airplanes all the time, and even, before I went into school, much older kids would come over to the house and ask if I could go over to their house to help them, tune their airplane to make it fly better, and because I understood the principles. And could apply them, and it's not that they're great in number or complex, but the only reason that any of us can apply them is, number one, we don't ascertain them, and number two, then we don't faithfully apply them. Any deviation is less successful than a completely faithful application of the principles. And this just holds for all life. Why do we do anything else with the truth? We say the truth can save us, but there is only one truth. There's always one truth. And whenever it's a mathematic riddle, there is always, always, always one answer. Why would anyone want to run off with something else, or throw rocks at the only answer, or the person that speaks it, or something like that? Our behavior in this regard is literally, it is just so bizarre and self-destructive, defeating, divisive. It's terrible. I remember, for instance, one time I was probably about 4 years old, wasn't even in school, hung out with the big kids, I wasn't supposed to go, you had groups of houses back in those days, but they'd be surrounded by wherever you lived, marshes, farmland, creeks, woods, brush, hills, all this stuff going all different directions. And, you know, and there are certain dangers. I lived around creeks that, in the Central Valley of California, you know, you have, it's very, very, very deep topsoil generally in all the flatlands, and any creek that flows through them has straight up and down banks which crumble away. If you have a rainstorm, the creeks would fill up to their tops like that, and it might be, you know, 30 or 40 feet down the banks of the creeks, you know, to the bottom. And so if you were in a creek, it might be, you know, a mile or 2 miles sometimes before there was a spot in the bank that you could even climb out of there, you know. And so if it got to raining, you know, you'd have a flash flood, and a kid here would drown, a kid there would drown, and there was other things that you weren't supposed to go through, you know, to, like we had canals everywhere, irrigation canals, and people would fall in them and drown. The water was actually pretty stiff. And also, you know, there was DDT sprayed everywhere, you know. And anyway, your mother would generally tell you, you know, don't go past the neighborhood. You know, you had to tell where you were going and, you know, and when you were going to be back. And, you know, that's a regular thing for families, right? Well, I was hanging out with these older kids one day, and one of them was, you know, he says, you guys want to see something that's really scary, you know? And there was a friend of mine and I were the same age, and the rest of these kids were older guys. There's about 4 or 5, 6 of these older kids. We're like 4 years old, and they're like, 10, you know? And anyway, so they take us on this circuitous route out of the neighborhood, around all these marshes and brushy areas, along this creek, and, you know, a place I'm not supposed to go until way, way off. You know, we get to this spot where we crawl through this thick brush and everything to get to the edge of the creek and look across the creek, and there in this little wooded glen is a house, you know, and the house is, you know, the side of it that's not facing us directly is, you know, well off the ground, and there's a lot of space under the house, and some of it had been used for storage, and there's an opening into the crawl space, and there's an archery target in there in the dark, which is, you know, 3 feet in diameter or something like that. And these big kids say, you know what that is? And we're too young to know it's an archery target. Although, you know, I could see it was an inanimate object, but, you know, these big kids tell us it's a bullseye. There's a bullseye under this house over there, you know, and it's some great big giant bull, because that's just his eye, you know, this big target. So, you know, they try and make us afraid, and then there we are, stranded so far away from home that, you know, most little kids wouldn't know their way back again, and they run off as if they're scared, you know, leaving us there. Well, you know, as ridiculous as that event is, it's really amazing how in purportedly adult life we carry forth those same kinds of behavior. We're afraid of a government which is constantly betraying us, doesn't have a chance to stand up against us if we only stood up against it united. And yet we allow it to violate all our laws, to subvert our courts, the very purposes of our courts, the very purposes of our laws, the very purposes of representation, and largely to persist in this huge crime, because, of course, all crime seeks a reward. And so you follow the money, and you find, you know, what is the crime? And exploitation is the crime, and its principal exponent is this obfuscation of the currency. And of course, its takings from us are so great that by far more than we can. It can afford to purchase every political candidate who ever thinks to rise. It's the only thing that can promote these political candidates through the news media that it owns, and so on and so forth. So, if we don't realize this, what are we doing complaining that the media, is brainwashing us? Well, number one, you're watching it. You don't have to watch it. If it isn't giving you the truth, what are you watching it for? If you believe anything that it tells you that isn't true, who's to blame? Did you filter through that yourself? Did you determine what the truth is, regardless of whatever was said? Did you yourself analyze why it was said? What is the object of it? What is the object of this news media if all that it does is consistent with these kinds of things? With this fact that we'll never be given the real truth about banking and its subversion of politics across the world. So we can't complain about being brainwashed or fed chemicals. I mean, yeah, we may not want these chemicals to be in our water, our food, our air. But if we're to stop that, just complaining against the chemicals when they may become objects of renegade, run-amok government serving banking for the purpose of exploitation and sharing in our dispossession, we're missing the real point. We don't know that they put chlorine or whatever in our water to ruin our ability to perform critical thinking. And what even if they do, when we ourselves could exercise critical thinking and don't? One of the states here in the States, Missouri, is got a saying. It's called the "Show Me State," and what the saying is about is whatever somebody claims, show me. I caught an 84-inch trout the other day. Oh, show me. It's a pride in critical thinking, which is sort of upheld, or the practitioners sort of are reminded by formally adopting, this slogan of "Show me." Our state is the "Show me" state. That's the real problem with the world, is that we've abandoned critical thinking ourselves. We've abandoned principles. We've abandoned faithfulness to principles. I was meaning to talk about a few things today to give you the idea of what the daily battle is. In truth, I would say that I'm hearing from so many people now. I don't have any time to myself even to do the things about mathematically perfected economy, which I've intended to devote my time to. I have so many issues, arguments, fights, pleas against the court system, pleas against the bankers, pleas against the politicians, propositions of alternate solution thrown at me to answer again and again and again, that I have no time to myself any longer. And unlike we've recently addressed here in this forum, the people I'm hearing from are largely respective of a fact of singular solution and of unequivocal, comprehensive arguments for facts. So I generally don't have these problems, but that we seem in this forum to think are deserving or prevalent. We have people claiming that money is created out of thin air, that it's the root of all evil. We have people asking actually denigrating me. In fact, let me dig it up for a second. I'm going to pause this a minute here, but I'm going to dig up a question that was thrown at Ivan just the other day. Now this is a person you might recognize, but I won't mention the name. He's asking Ivan. He says quite a few things. I hope there's no harsh feelings here. He accuses Ivan of attempting to insulate me from the negativity in the chat rooms, and Ivan's not attempting to protect me, from some emotional thing that I'm incapable of dealing with. I've been doing this for 44 years, and if you don't think I've dealt with, the most vicious people on this earth, you're out of your damn minds, because it's pretty much on a regular basis in places like this. But I'm scanning through this to get to the meat of it. It goes round and round around the bush as if Ivan's protecting me and he won't present a question. So this person asks, how has he, meaning me, how has he gone about implementing mathematically perfected economy over the last 40 years? Now, he's trying to stress this. Ivan's reluctant to answer because, the question is meant to put Ivan in a difficulty. And this person says he was serious about the question. Well, sure he was. But what do you mean by this? How has Mike Montagne gone about implementing mathematically perfected economy in the last 40 years? Think about that question. What does it mean to ask that? Is that a positive question? Here he is trying to, in truth, denigrate me or slander me because I haven't done anything to implement it. One person arguing for mathematically perfected economy for 44 years hasn't actually implemented it himself. Well, there's reasons, which we've explained over and over and over again. In fact, I'll get to another post, and come to think of it, which addresses the same issues. But there's reasons why we have to have not a conglomeration of alternate currencies, but only one currency, and that alone solves our problems. So for me to implement it, obviously, as is consistent with everything that's ever been said about this, it isn't a matter of me implementing it. I would have to force it upon you in order to implement it. If you don't adopt it, it will never be implemented, because by necessity it is something that we all do to justify our interaction with each other. I can't do it by myself. That's impossible. So he's asking me to have proven that I've performed something that's impossible, as if the fact that I haven't somehow is a slight against my work, proving evidently that it's unworthy of adoption, or that it doesn't deserve to be adopted, that it can't solve our problems somehow. Well, none of those issues are addressed by the question, which, if it was a genuine or worthy attempt to invalidate my work, would instead say, no, there's another solution to inflation and deflation, and here's what it is and why that solves it instead, or likewise, whatever is the case. So he goes on he says he's quoting himself from the night before, and then he repeats that the question was for me, and then he says that Ivan avoided asking me. Well, Ivan finally did send it to me, and he says that he wasn't trying to avoid it. He wasn't understanding what this person who asked it meant, because after all, what does he mean? What did Mike do to implement it? Why is it Mike who would implement something that's got to be a solution for all of us if it's going to accomplish what it's to accomplish? It isn't up to me. But this is what I'm talking about, this kind of negativity. Who is this person to throw such a question at me? So he says, he's sorry, Ivan, for someone who can grasp MPE, you can't even comprehend a simple question. So don't think that this person is being positive. It's all negative. He's pretending that Ivan can't understand the question. But Ivan has said he doesn't understand what he means by asking it. And what can we understand that he means by asking it? What answer can I give, or anyone give, who comes up with a solution, when that solution has to be adopted by the people in order for it to be implemented, and you're blaming the person that came up with the answer for its lack of implementation? That's pointing the finger the other way. And that's all that is. We're not children. We know that. I mean, you can all be children if you want, but still, that's childish. That's all that is. So he's claiming the whole bunch of people in the chat were able to figure it out, and they started repeating the question to you. Okay, so in the end, he re-asked the question. This is the question. How has he gone about implementing the mathematically perfected economy over the past 40 years? So Ivan sent me this, and here's my regular day for you. I get things like this thrown at me all day long, as if I haven't done enough, right? And so all of a sudden, it's for me to answer this question of this person, and I'm tempted. I'm tempted to say their name because it's probably a friend of yours. He's in the forum, and there's all these people, as he's saying. I didn't even look. I'm not watching the damn thing because this is, I'm sorry. If this is what you are, why are you even listening to the program? Why are you even listening to the program? If you know that something else is solution somehow, you're not expressing it. You're accusing the failure to ever implement this. You're putting the blame on the person who's explained it over and over and over again, when in fact, unless you understand it and adopt it, and it hasn't been explained in any terms which are incomprehensible. It's been explained in the only terms which are comprehensible, and yet you have failed to adopt it. So he asks, how has Mike Montagne gone about implementing the mathematically perfected economy over 40 years? So I just shot this answer back to Ivan immediately, because if I don't cover the bases, my integrity can be tarnished by people who impotently denigrate you by claiming what they're to blame for is your blame. Number one, speaking in the third person, he has proved singular solution to a sum of no more than 3 possible categoric faults of any prospective monetary thesis. This is what I've done to implement solution. This is my answer. So you can all jump up and down in the forum and shout and cry against me for this is what I'm claiming I have done for over 40 years, for 44 years. 1, he has proved singular solution to a sum of no more than 3 possible categoric faults of any prospective monetary thesis. What more can you do than that? A fact of one and one only mathematically perfected economy. Presumably, this alone is more than all prior monetary theory because it invalidates all prior monetary theory, which of course is wholly bereft of proof or theorem. Likewise, presumably, this alone would be enough to compel any intelligent, deserving, self-determined people to themselves adopt the principles of mathematically perfected economy, and to decide how they wanted to implement those principles. Would it not? 2. He developed and proved a singular just means not only for transforming any contemporary system of exploitation or obfuscation of the promissory obligations of the people into mathematically perfected economy in as little as part of a day, not only in as little as part of a day, but even virtually without cost. Is that not a phenomenal thing to never act upon? This is accomplished rightly by no more than A, counting all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, B, resuming remaining payment, if any, at the obligatory schedules of payment of mathematically perfected economy, and C, by reflating the circulation to a representative volume by crediting the accounts of the people according to a pattern of savings and spending consistent with savings and spending which would sustain a standard of living across retirement. End of point 2. That's the means of transforming it. Not only have I proven a singular solution, I proved a singular just means of transforming the present systems into mathematically perfected economy in as little as part of a day and without cost. 3. He prescribed the generic means of implementing and sustaining a mathematically perfected economy through a common monetary infrastructure, restoring the universal right to issue promissory obligations free of extrinsic manipulation, adulteration, or denial of the opportunity to fulfill them. His original work proves this infrastructure, in which the people issue the currency, is the only just and sustainable monetary proposition. Likewise, it is the most imitated and plagiarized proposition in monetary history. Virtually all contemporary imitators advocate eradicating interest without even being able, still, to articulate why and how. 4. Even his original work invalidates every contending monetary proposition. Yet he has explicitly invalidated the pretended solutions of 11th-hour impostors who have regularly only stolen his work to errantly deduce that money can't be debt, that interest must be spent into circulation with the principal, that money must be spent or gifted into circulation, that any arbitrary term of payment suffices, that private banking can solve our problems respective to representation. 5. He has produced a global mandate in which the people as signatories establish mathematically perfected economy, dictating mathematically perfected economy to government and denying any authority in violation of their dictate. I later add a 6th point, but then I say in summary of these 5, but you are right in your vicious intent to denigrate Mr. Montagne, Mr. Murphy. That worthless whatever has indeed failed to do the most important thing of all. He can't be a mathematically perfected economy by himself, can he? No, that's not a question. Because you were right. He hasn't actually implemented a damn thing. Even as he responds, as the models he provided the Reagan administration themselves model sustainability, they persist in perfectly immutable currency if you simply input zero interest in his prescribed obligatory schedule of payment. So you're right, Dave. He hasn't accomplished a damn thing. Because over 44 years, he still hasn't succeeded in forcing us to choose mathematically perfected economy. Likewise, so long as you believe your question is more than rhetorical, he never will. And that's his fault, is it? I later added a sixth point. I've received no answer from this person in your forum. Incidentally, Dave, what have you done? So these are the kinds of people and the things that they think against me, who constantly rail against mathematically perfected economy, of all things. People regularly ask me, and I regularly ask myself, why do I even bother enduring any of that? If you think that whoever would say anything such as that, what has Mike Montagne done to implement mathematically perfected economy? If you think that's a slight against my work, that you haven't done it, then, write Vin, ask him to take me off the air right away, because, I don't want you for an audience. I don't want to, if that's all I'm talking to, I have no purpose here. I don't want to waste my day. I don't want to go through, people throwing rocks at me like this. I'm not masochistic, and I'm certainly not, disposed to perpetual futility. But if you want them, amidst you, to be part of our steps towards solution, what are you doing tolerating this? If I want to hear, I want to hear. I'm not going to be busy typing into a forum every moment. I can do that. I can type very fast, and I can listen to somebody speaking on something, and everything that's wrong with it that I can elaborate on and prove comprehensively is wrong with it. I can type it out, my points, my questions or whatever, practically as fast as somebody can speak. Indeed, but that's not what's going on here. Somebody's contrived a question which they think invalidates all my efforts, which reduces them to naught. And when it all hinges on the fact that they haven't even acted on it. If we don't act on solution, is that to the denigration of the advocate of solution, or is that to the denigration of us? That's the question. And if you say it's to the advocate, fine. Tell Vin you want me off the air and I'm out of here, because I don't have time for you either. Why you're listening to me, I have no idea. But if it's just to throw rocks, then what are you? Excuse me. Well, I know there's many good people that are listening too, because, I hear from them, and it's unfortunate that we have these kinds of people. And if it was up to me, a swift hook. And I have that power. I've never exercised it. I can yank anybody I want to out of the forum at any time. There hasn't been a person that's gone away yet. Why? In part because I care. I'm not out to prove the rest of my few days that, I'm an idiot. By speaking to people who don't want the message. If you don't want the message, I'm out of here. If there's somebody who does want the message, that's another matter, But we need to get off to the side somewhere where we don't have to see that. I used to have people that watched, listen to these programs, and they've told me, we already know all this, and I don't want to watch these people, insult you constantly. Who are they, and, they don't even want to see it. So, we're losing listeners, and we might have some more listeners who want to, learn that, we're genetically modified by some aliens who've abducted us for 200,000 years and built circles which aren't even circles, and somehow those circles express the resonance of the earth without even, anyone who claims this explaining that there was a way that they determined that there was a radius of the circle. What is the radius of the circle? Is it aligned differently on the polar axis versus the circumferential axis of the earth? Was the radius to the center of the rock wall, which is irregular, not even elliptical? I mean, why we believe these things even, or consider them important enough to consider, I have no idea. But that's my problem. If people are denigrating, me here, I'm wasting my time. I got much more important things to do, because there are people who want to resolve this issue, and those are the only people I care to communicate with. The rest of you can throw rocks, but off in the side. Go ahead, delight yourselves. Make a effigy of me and burn it. I don't give a damn what you do, but I'm not here to just simply endure whatever desultation you can throw my way, claiming that the onus is on me that you haven't adopted this. How can one person, after all, implement an economy by themselves? Come on, And as I've explained over and over again, you can't do these separate alternate currencies. In fact, come to think of it, here's a response that I gave to a positive person. This person has praised me as being a leading patriot and whatnot in the last day, and wrote a number of assertions to me, which I can read. The first was, if we hire the sheriff with the local currency, we can end income or property taxes or foreclosures and victimless crimes. Well, no, that's not true. Because the sheriff has to adopt the local currency, and the only reason they're going to do it is if we all adopt it. But if it's a local currency, it's only local because it hasn't been made interchangeable with the other currency. Furthermore, we have all the problems of the banking currency that we're dealing with, which is still multiplying indebtedness upon, our ability to persist in industry and commerce. So with that ending it, so what if we have a local currency? It isn't as if we can stay in our house. It isn't that we can keep our shop. It isn't that we can continue to own and operate our equipment when we've defaulted on debts because the banking system's multiplication of falsified indebtedness imposed conditions on us where we could no longer fulfill the falsified contracts that they imposed upon us by a breach of trust. You see, you're not solving the problems. Now, before any of the people came up with alternate currencies, they came to me. They asked me for my blessing. All the people that were, not all the people, but many of the people, the first people who were producing gold and silver coins, here in the States illegally, asked me for their blessing. I said it was illegal, and I said it didn't solve any of the problems. They still have links to my web pages on their websites even. But they engaged in this anyway without my blessing. And during the 2008 presidential election, these people were closed down. Their gold and silver was taken away from them. They were put out of business. Why? Because it was illegal. Now, likewise, did it solve any problems? Did it arrest perpetual multiplication of falsified indebtedness? No, obviously not. Absolutely not. Did it avert failure? No. But I'm going to answer all these points here in an answer. This is regular work. I did this today before I prepared for today's broadcast. This is just the first thing that I did this morning, as a matter of fact. While the coffee water is heating up, he says further, I'm setting up a local debt or usury-free currency It's in Colorado, which is hour-based, and I have agreed with other hour-based systems in the U.S. and Canada to exchange without exchange fees. Okay. Now we've gone over this over and over and over again. Do you see any problem with that? I mean, his intentions are absolutely good, but the thing is, if they can't achieve the objects and they divert us from a solution, where are we going with this? And I'm going to answer to this. He says he's very interested in mathematically perfected economy for financing homes at what he calls such low payments. They're not low payments. They're just a rate of payments that equates to paying for what we consume as we consume of it, which is indispensable to an immutable currency. So they're not low, they're right, they're correct. Low would be below that, to pay for less than you're consuming, which we can't justify and which won't maintain an immutable currency because it's deflationary. To pay more or to pay more is deflationary, whereas to pay less is inflationary. Excuse me. So those are the reasons. We've gone over there many times, but why wouldn't you object to this yourself? I mean, if we understand these things, if we just sat down and mastered these few simple principles, we would see all these things ourselves, and we wouldn't even be tempted to contemplate these things. Someone else would write this person in response. And then I'm not going to denigrate them here. I am answering to their I'm reaffirming that mathematically perfected economy achieves the objects that they want to achieve itself and itself alone. Here we're deviating from it, but this person is intending well, So they claim that, for example, Ithaca Hours activists have loaned $30,000 equivalent hours to the local credit union interest free. Well, yeah, but is anybody spending it? And if they have, even if they have, is that non-inflationary? What have they loaned it for? Is it being paid out of circulation then at the rate of consumption of the related property? If not, it's either inflationary or deflationary. What's more, it hasn't solved inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. Just because you have another money that isn't subject to interest doesn't mean that interest that's applied to ownership of all of our virtually all of our property isn't still causing the same effects that it is. See? So to propose an alternate currency as if it's solving anything isn't solving anything at all. Why? Because debt continues to multiply by interest. So until you get rid of interest on all the currency, all that's going to happen is the obligations imposed upon us and multiply perpetually in proportion to our capacity to pay by the obfuscation of the currency will just suck up the alternate currencies and devote them to that same unwarranted object in effect. So he goes on to muse about a few things. We would have to find someone who owned their house outright to set up an example, I guess. Well, that's not true at all. And it's really irrelevant. And what an amazing experiment it would be to show the people how innovated money can outcompete the existing parasitic system. Well, indeed, we have the exact same object. This person is not being derogatory and musing about these things and actually instigating an initiative to try an alternate currency. But there's already these alternate currencies. And why aren't they prolifically used? And if they already exist to any extent, how do we say that they've actually solved our problems? If you have two different entities that issue currency for the same things, obviously those obligations that are going to exist in representation and redeemability conflict with each other. That can't be justice. Both objects can't be upheld. But if the original imposed currency requires us to pay interest and principal out of a circulation comprised of only some remaining principal and multiplies falsified indebtedness into terminal indebtedness just the same, however many further alternate currencies exist all around it, what's the point? Why do we pretend to ourselves that an alternate currency would accomplish some object? It accomplishes no object at all. So when these people who developed these first of these alternate currencies contacted me, they likewise asked me for their blessing, and I explained to them, no, it doesn't solve anything. So this idea is 20 years old. It rises in the wake of my work. People use my essays and thinking to justify these alternate currencies. The initial ones asked me for their blessing. I proved that it wouldn't solve our issues. It likely would never even be adopted universally because you have to have one currency for it to be a universal currency, and that's the one that has to have all the principles right. If it coexists with a currency subject to interest or this obfuscation, even the fact that this obfuscation launders principal into the unwarranted possession of bankers who merely publish further representations of our promissory obligations, if you even suffer that alongside alternate currencies, you're going to launder all the principal in existence into the unwarranted possession of the banking system. So it's ignorant, but it is. It's ignorant to think that any of these alternate propositions can help us. And all these people, you've heard them. I interviewed John Turmel, for instance, and I tried to explain to him that no, it doesn't solve anything. So here we are repeating ourselves and repeating ourselves and repeating ourselves. So anyway, this is my response. This is just something that I wrote this morning, and it's an example of what my day is filled with. These kinds of things to respond to. Wayne, there's really no need to perform an experiment to understand that the consequences of the schedule, what the consequences of the schedule of payment are. This very moment, under the present system, perfectly well demonstrates our case and need for solution. For example, if we've paid 5 years against a mortgage before falling 6 months in arrears, then as a basic 12-to-1 disparity between the rates of payment under the present system and mathematically perfected economy, predicate that our 5 years of payment under the present system of exploitation equates to 60 years of payment under mathematically perfected economy. The fact the banking system has obfuscated our promissory obligations into falsified debts to itself, therefore is vital for us to understand, because in no other way can we unite over a further fact that interest cannot be justified, because the purported banking system has nothing at stake but the negligible costs of printing our money, something which, of course, we could better do ourselves. The facts: A, that there is no debt to the banking system; B, that our promissory obligations remain obligations to pay and to retire principal from circulation; C, that interest is entirely unwarranted; and D, that our vital object of an immutable currency is only sustained by an obligatory schedule of payment retiring principal at the rate of consumption of each related property. Therefore resolve the present hypothetical mortgage case to a fact that E, all prior payments of interest must be counted instead toward principal. In other words, I'm just repeating the math again and again and again. People constantly come up against it and have to be corrected, and that's all we're doing here, is correcting people. And F, that the 12-to-1 disparity in the rate of payment places the mortgage at year 60 of the rectified schedule of payment under mathematically perfected economy. Thus, the default is rightly resolved to a fact that in the stead of foreclosure, the debtor has made 60 years of payments at year 5 of the rectified schedule of payment. None of the principal or interest belongs to the purported banking system, for it didn't even print the money. In other words, here in the United States, the Federal Reserve has the Treasury print the currency, and then it pays for the cost. So it doesn't even, so that payment goes to the Treasury, even if it might be the payments might be taken by the Federal Reserve banks, the central banks, but they're not performing the printing, they're just paying for it. Not only is the foreclosure resolved in this hypothetical case, the obligor, formerly the falsified debtor, is so far ahead of their rectified schedule of payment that they don't need to make another payment for 54.5 years. 60 years paid minus 5.5 years into the schedule of payment. Moreover, when the obligor resumes payments 54.5 years down the road, the resumed payments are 1/12 what they were under usury. Now think about that a minute. This is what you're arguing about when you're throwing stones at Mike Montagne. What has he done to implement mathematically perfected economy? Here we are. We have a mortgage that's 5 years into payment, 5-year-old mortgage. It's been paid against for 5 years. Then for a half a year, the debtor has fallen, the falsified debtor has fallen behind half a year in payments. They're in foreclosure. If we immediately transition to adopt it, that means you, Dave, have to adopt it. And all you other people who are throwing stones, you have to adopt it for it to happen. A great number of us could do a separate economy, but unless it was a great number of us, it would be relatively pointless because, as I say, the present system is going to impose terminal failure upon all of us. It will, the multiplication of falsified indebtedness will just suck up the principal from the other circulation and dedicate it to the obfuscated currencies objects, which are exploitation. So here you are, you're throwing rocks at me saying, what have I done to implement this, when it can't happen unless you implement it. And here we have 5 years into a mortgage, 5.5 years into a mortgage. We paid for 5 years. We're 6 months in arrears. And if we adopted mathematically perfected economy, instead of paying $1,000 a month, we would be paying $83.33 a month, 1/12 as much. And we wouldn't even make another payment for another 54.5 years. And you're saying, what's wrong with Mike Montagne's idea because we haven't adopted it? So I continue my answer. None of the principal or interest belongs to the purported banking system, for it didn't even print the money. Not only is the foreclosure resolved in this hypothetical case, the obligor, formerly the falsified debtor, is so far ahead of their rectified schedule of payment that they don't need to make another payment for 54.5 years. 60 years minus 5.5 years into the schedule of payment is the math. Moreover, when the obligor resumes payments 54.5 years down the road, the resumed payments are 1/12 what they were under usury. According to our regular example of a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan, where the payments under mathematically perfected economy are $1,000 per year, as opposed to approximately $1,000 per month under the central banking systems which have been imposed upon the world, for example, payments are reduced from $1,000 per month under usury to $83.33 per month overall under mathematically perfected economy. It's important for everyone to understand then that these numbers are not just simply picked out of the blue, nor is a fact of singular solution merely whimsical. I don't mean to shoot your initiative down, but long before any of these alternate currencies sprung up, many of the first asked for my blessings. My work disproved they solved anything, but to sustain little industrial commercial activity of a locale, only so long as that activity could sustain itself against the falsified and inevitably terminal conditions imposed by the outer central banking system. Why? You're not really solving any of these issues. True potential trade is only sustained by a universally acceptable currency. Few are going to use the alternate currency, and the reasons for non-participation are reasonable. A. You don't arrest multiplication of falsified indebtedness by the imposed system. B. You don't avert terminal failure. C. Neither do you avert escalated dispossession all the way to that inevitable failure. D. Nor are any of these systems solving the fundamental faults of inflation, deflation, systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, and or maldisposition. Now, they may solve one or more of those potential faults, but not all of them. And in fact, even inflation and deflation can be terminal. So to think that, oh, so what, it gets most of it right, let's settle on a compromise, is absolutely preposterous. You haven't done any of the math. You haven't thought about any of these things seriously if you just casually assume that, well, it's okay if we fall somewhere short of solution. But having solution, why do we argue to compromise it or deviate from it? Or not to adopt it, blaming it on Mike Montagne? These are serious deficiencies, I go on. My question is, why talk about them even if that only distracts us from the only solution? After all, these, and by talk about them, I mean over and over and over and over again. Every Johnny-come-lately who jumps into this just seems to think, oh, I'll just do this. And it's already been proposed umpteen jillion times, and it's not a solution. My original work proves it's not a solution. So why talk about it again and again and again? All it evidences is that we haven't even done our diligence. We haven't even discovered that doesn't exist, or that proposition already exists, but it's even implemented in many cases, but it hasn't proven to solve anything. You see, is it reduced even the amount that the debt of the world is multiplying as we speak? It's impossible for it to reduce it, because that circulation has to be maintained in order to service those debts, and it's only maintained by borrowing principal and interest back into our general possession as an ever greater sum of debt. So as long as we maintain whatever circulation we have, debt continues to multiply, exactly as it would otherwise, no matter how many further alternate currencies we have. So you're not even solving anything, So, as I say, my question is, why even talking about these things repeatedly if that only distracts us from the only solution? After all, these 11th hour propositions are raised in the wake of solution, compromising solution, as opposed to leading the way. Another problem I have with a purportedly time-based currency, which is what he's proposed, is there's no such fact. Many are saying that currencies or economies have to be energy-based, resource-based, time-based. None of these propositions can stand, but why not? When we evaluate value, and thus cost, we are evaluating many things. Ultimately, we are comparing others' contribution to the overall pool of wealth to our own contributions to the overall pool of wealth. To do so, we are not just evaluating time, because we are evaluating the quality of the efforts which are expended over time. Neither, then, are we just evaluating the quality of potential skills invested in production, For the matter of worth is decided by the explicit skills, which are generally a subset of all overall skills. We aren't evaluating energy alone, then, either. In fact, energy is irrelevant except as a cost of production if we have to pay for energy invested in production. Neither are we evaluating resources, for what each of us contributes to the overall pool of wealth is not the resource itself, but instead is the endeavor to harvest it and to render it into further forms of production. The only justifiable unit of any just currency, therefore, is an abstraction, because it must represent whatever the many things which determine worth. In the end, what we want and need is an abstract unit. Every unit, no matter how we otherwise attempt to skew it, becomes an abstract unit because we determine relative value in all the terms we will. No good economic design can attempt to impose either a value or singular dimension upon a just currency. It is, however, incumbent upon us to ensure immutable value as determined by truly free markets and industry, because only so do we sustain what we decide in our industrial commercial endeavors, and only so do we protect ourselves from artificial aberration or mutation. These reasons, of course, are just part of why I have advocated for 44 years that mathematically perfected economy is a singular solution. There, of course, is no other solution for inflation and deflation. There is no other solution for systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. There is no other solution for inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. And why, ladies and gentlemen? Because interest isn't justified, and therefore, since its consequence is terminal dispossession, and it's not justified, nothing, but nothing at all, solves the consequences of interest, but an eradication of interest, because interest is an injustice. And finally, there is no other immutable currency, and there is no other monetary justice. Our division, therefore, is what is killing us. Patriotism isn't allegiance to a country or to other people, regardless what is right or wrong. Patriotism is allegiance most of all and first of all to incontrovertible universal principles. And it's through those universal principles that it is an allegiance to all other just people and all other just people only. There are those who are saying we can't have solution right away. Here we are, 44 years after a fact of solution emerged, and people are still standing up as mathematically perfected economy. Or just as if mathematically perfected economy were just another thought of the moment, to be forestalled by our own apathy and disinterest for 44 more years, and 44 more years still. There are those who are saying we can't have solution right away because neither banking nor government will grant us solution. We must seek compromise, they say. Who are banking and government to deny solution to a people worthy and deserving of self-government? We can mess around like this forever. If one solution will save us, then we are our own worst enemy. Because united, we would have had these things a long while ago. If, on the other hand, multiple propositions somehow arrest the present terminal failure, we already have those propositions and their every permutation. Have they saved the world? Obviously not. I can't make people adopt mathematically perfected economy. I can only defend and preserve its original proposition. It's a sad testament to humanity, I think, then, that so many, and ever more, choose instead to divide us amongst half-baked proposition after half-baked 11th hour propositions, as if deviation were worthwhile. There's only one way we're ever going to have solution, and that is to stand for nothing less. I decided to add a quote to this. I don't like to quote others so much, but I added that Thomas Jefferson implicitly addressed our prospects so. Jefferson said, quote, "Only lay down true principles and adhere to them inflexibly. Do not be frightened into their surrender by the alarms of the timid or the croakings of the wealthy against the ascendancy of the people. The true foundation of Republican government is the equal right of every citizen in his person and property and in their management. Try by this as a tally every provision of our Constitution and see if it hangs directly on the will of the people." Thanks again for listening. I'm Mike Montagne, and we are all related.